Hey, good afternoon. My name is Daniel Schreier, and I am a special assistant to the director, OSEP director at the U.S. Department of Education. Good afternoon and good morning. I'm very excited for today's session. We are going to go into the weeds about current legislative and executive priorities within Congress and in the department and the White House, and it's got a great panel here. So I'm going to introduce them. And so first we have Kuna Tavalan, who's the Senior Advisor for Policy and Advocacy for the Council for Exceptional Children. Kuna has 2 decades of experience in public affairs, advocacy, and strategic planning in the education and human services arenas. Kuna focuses on federal policy, encompassing appropriations, special education, early education, family engagement, child welfare, and juvenile justice. So I have Caitlin Brennan, who's the policy advisor at the Higher Education Consortium for Special Education and the Teacher Education Division of the Council for Exceptional Children. And Caitlin currently serves as a policy advisor. Additionally, she serves as a consultant with the American Association of Colleges for Teachers Education, provides policies advising services to a number of local nonprofit education organizations. And then Sharon Walsh, who is a consultant with the Division for Early Childhood of the Council of Exceptional Children and the IDA Infant and Toddler Coordinators Association. Sharon's provided consultation on the implementation of IDA for over 35 years. She currently is the government relations consultant for the Division of Early Childhood Education of the CEC and the IDA Infant and Toddler Coordinator Association. Sharon also is a consultant on the OSEP-funded Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center and their Center for IDA Early Childhood Data Systems. So so welcome all. I'm so glad you guys could join us, and really looking forward to hearing from you all about what you're hearing up on the Hill and in our headquarters building. So before we do that, I just want to briefly give a shout out to all the work that we've been doing at the department for the past year. Since last year, after last year's leadership conference, we been issuing a lot of policy documents, and I'd be remiss not to sort of shout out and encourage folks to take a look at them. Sort of resources that have been developed are information on long COVID that we've done with OCR. We've done guidance on Child Fund under IDA Part B and Part C, requirements for IEPs and IFSPs. We provided updated guidance on the equitable service requirements for parentally placed private school children with disabilities, and obviously the discipline and supporting students guidance that's just come out this week. So we have a ton of resources that have been issued. I'll try to put in some links during while our presenters are presenting. The other thing too is the department has a lot of fantastic resources where OSER's played a large role in their assisting their development and their publications. So definitely, if you haven't spent time on our website, we have a lot of fantastic resources, and I strongly encourage you and recommend you to take a look at them in your free time. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Kuna. Looking forward to the presentation. Thanks for joining us, Kuna.
Thank you very much, and it's my absolute pleasure to be here as well. As we're loading the slides, I just want to once again say thank you to everyone who has joined us. I am going to start us off in a couple of slides. If we could just go to the agenda, thank you. By grounding my conversation in what the Council for Exceptional Children advances as their policy priorities, and then talk a little bit about some recent action that we've seen in Congress, what is happening right now on Capitol Hill, and then what may take place for the remainder of the year. So I'm going to start by grounding us in CEC's policy priorities, because these really drive the work that I do. This is not a comprehensive list of priorities, but this is really what we use as our guide for engaging at the federal level. So the first priority is to protect and support the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That is really the reason that our members, who are special educators that run the gamut from early interventionists all the way through higher education, in classrooms, administrators, that's really kind of their core reason for the work that they do. Protecting and expanding policies that may be outside of IDEA, but that also impact children with disabilities and with gifts and talents, and also twice exceptional children. And then looking kind of at the workforce, which Kate is going to talk more about later on in this panel, but really figuring out how we can impact the full educator pipeline to strengthen the profession so that we can have more personnel in place to serve infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities and gifts and talents. One of CEC's major leading roles is in funding for IDEA, and that happens through the annual appropriations process, which I will talk about again shortly. And then finally, advocating for policies that impact school, child educator well-being, safe and inclusive and supportive schools, school-based mental health policy, and so on. So the first things I'm going to talk about, if you could advance, please. The first thing is the appropriations cycle. This is, for folks who aren't tracking closely, this is an annual cycle. To give you a very basic idea of how it works, typically in February, the president and all of the departments release a budget proposal that's sent to Capitol Hill. That typically launches the budget and appropriations cycle and gets Congress churning on their annual job to deliver appropriations to determine funding levels for the fiscal year. Then Congress, kind of on an ongoing basis, but really starting after that budget is dropped, starts to solicit and take input from stakeholders. That can be citizens, that can be other members of Congress, it can be hearing from department officials. Secretary Cardona has spoken to the House and Senate about the budget for the Department of Education, for example. And then between May and July, the House typically drafts, marks up, which means goes through an amendment process and passes their bills. The Senate is typically just a month or so behind the House in terms of action. And then ideally, Congress has passed all of their spending bills, there are 12 of them, by the September 30th deadline, which is the last day of the current fiscal year, so that when the new fiscal year starts on October 1st, everything is all set. I've been doing this work for 2 decades. I've never seen Congress meet that September 30th deadline. What they have to do in that case is either pass a continuing resolution that extends existing funding levels until they can agree on new ones, or in rare and tragic cases, we see a federal government shutdown. So where are we today in that process? Well, it's July, so we haven't quite hit that September deadline yet. The budget was released on March 28th, so much later than that typical February timeline. That was in part due to the fact that Congress needed an almost 6-month extension to complete their action on last year's process. So that really skewed the timelines. The House has taken that new budget proposal and run with it. They've passed all of their 12 spending bills out of the committee, and they are currently working to pass small packages of spending bills on the House floor. We expect that process to be completed this month. The Senate has not released the text of any of their bills or done any action yet, although we're getting indications that the bills could be posted, which means revealed but not necessarily considered, by the end of July. And it seems like on Capitol Hill, people are already starting to talk about a continuing resolution to get us through the elections, which I'll talk about more a little further down the road. Now, pivoting from, so just to get into the details of the appropriations bill itself and where CEC and our partner organizations plug in, if we can go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about what those contents are of some of the proposals that we're working on. I apologize that this slide is really hard to read, but you will be looking at, you will have the slides available. So hopefully if you're interested and you can take a closer look. But for example, CEC is constantly pushing to fully fund IDEA. When we talk about that specifically, we're talking about the Grants to States program, the big pool of IDEA funding. And we've tailored our request to put IDEA funding on a 10-year glide path to full funding. Full funding is 40% of the excess cost to educate a student with a disability. We're currently hovering around 14% at the federal government level of the 40% that they pledged to cover. So the first step of that glide path would be around $16.3 billion. We're very fortunate that both this administration and the House have also really gotten on board with getting IDEA funding on that first rung. Just to highlight a few other programs that we're really pushing for, we have, in collaboration with Sharon, who will be talking right after me, worked on also creating a glide path for the early childhood programs within IDEA to really boost that funding to keep up with demand and prices and so forth. And then I just also want to pull out the Part D personnel preparation program. Kate will talk a little later about special educator shortages, and this program is really critical to building the workforce. So this is another program that we really lean in hard on. So most of the work we do at the federal level is long game work. It takes years to come together. Sometimes it can be a bit discouraging, frankly. And then every once in a while, things kind of align and something comes together really quickly. And that's what happened last month with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. The bill was put together after, I think, a bipartisan group of lawmakers said, enough is enough, we need to do something about these tragic school shootings that just keep happening. And, they're really hard, I think, for our field to endure, digest. They're completely traumatic. It's very difficult to get gun control legislation passed. It's a very polarizing issue. But in the context of schools, folks were able to get together to put forward a bipartisan package. It was debated, drafted, and enacted within a month. That's very unheard of in Congress, but like I said, sometimes things just align and something is able to move quickly. Now, CEC and our partners are not in the gun control conversation, but I do bring this bill up for two reasons. One, because it is proof that Congress really can move swiftly and in a bipartisan manner if the pressures are right. And also because there was a lot of very important funding included in this bill to improve conditions for school-based mental health. And I'll just pull out a few. There was $500 million each for the school-based mental health demonstration grants and services grants, and those programs are dedicated to increasing the number of school-based health personnel in schools, something that CEC has advocated for, and we were really pleased to see that come through. And then another $1 billion through the Title IV Part A program to improve school climate. So again, not necessarily related to the gun debate, but some really important provisions that we're hopeful will really improve conditions in schools. So the other really big piece of legislation that we've been working on that kind of is outside of the appropriations space, but that had a chance this year, was the Build Back Better Act. When it was initially proposed as the American Families Plan, which is part of President Biden's domestic policy agenda, it included some really critical provisions around attracting, preparing, and retaining a diverse educator workforce. Had $9 billion over 10 years for programs that would fund schools of education at historically Black colleges and other minority serving institutions. It had funding dedicated to that Part D personnel prep program that I just spoke of, and some more really important provisions to really bolster the educator workforce. That proposal has been tampered down to the point where we don't actually see any education provisions in it anymore. It looks like, if folks read the news, a very small package really focused on prescription drug piping could see the light of day, but all of those educator provisions have fallen by the wayside. And that is mostly because of politics and not policy. When it comes to the issues that are bubbling up in Washington, D.C., in the education space, I do want to first acknowledge that this is an unprecedented time in that we don't typically see a lot of conversation at the federal level, at the national level around education. I think that the pandemic has really shined a spotlight on education. For a variety of reasons that I don't think I need to get into, but we're seeing a lot of national conversations happening, not just in Congress, but in the news, in communities. And some of the things that we're really hearing bubble to the top inside the Beltway are the youth mental health crisis and the need to act on that. The Surgeon General has issued a declaration of a crisis in youth mental health, and we know that it stems from a variety of factors, but the ones that are really called out on Capitol Hill include the pandemic, they include social media, which is something that lawmakers really point to as a problem for older youth in particular. Of course, school shootings really impact mental health for children, and so on and so forth. Bullying that is also, longstanding pre-pandemic, but certainly impacts the conversation. Another area that folks are really talking about is teacher shortages. Of course, it's all over the news, but in a recent House Appropriations hearing on the federal budget, the emerging topic that all lawmakers were really asking about was teacher shortages, and it prompted a special hearing on the matter. And just from our perspective, we're hoping that we can really build on that to increase awareness and hopefully come to some helpful solutions. And then the last thing that continues to be on folks' minds is learning loss, recovery, closing some of those gaps that were amplified during the pandemic. And I see that there's one question about whether CEC supports other parts of IDEA that I didn't have listed in that grid. I just want to clarify, those are the things we lead on, but we are supportive of education funding much more broadly, and particularly all parts of IDEA. So the next thing that we ask ourselves is, so what's going to happen next? We're winding down the 117th Congress, and this tends to be the least productive part of a Congress, those few months leading up to an election. So just as a reminder for folks, every 2 years, all of the members of the House are up for re-election, as are a third of senators. And that's why productivity tends to slow for two reasons. Folks are spending more time at home campaigning. Folks are more polarized to differentiate themselves from their opponents. And so working together is much harder. So I don't expect much to happen between now and November, other than what we call our must do, which is something on appropriations before September 30th. With that, I am going to hand it over to my colleague Sharon to talk a little bit more about what's happening in the infants and toddlers space.
Thank you, Kuna, and hello, everyone. I'm really glad to join you this afternoon. My task, as Kuna said, is to bring the early childhood perspective to the many of the broad topics that she covered for us in that great update. So why don't we begin by looking at the agenda? I'm going to first make some reference to some of the bills that are currently pending, some of which Kuna talked about, and how they do relate to young children and their families. Spend a little time talking about the proposed Part C policy changes that are underway through the federal appropriations process. A couple of bills that we're really hoping get through or make much more progress. And in the case of one of them, we really need home visiting to be reauthorized before September 30th. We'll mention a couple of things in the queue waiting, and then I want to end with the important mention of what the priorities are for the two organizations that I'm representing today, both ITCA and Division for Early Childhood of CEC. So why don't we begin with just briefly Build Back Better. And I would assume that most of you would kind of chuckle or turn your head a little bit with a question mark when you even hear Build Back Better. It was something we heard that title so much for so long in the last year. And right now, it's, as Kuna said, we are down to very small parts of it, while there is still strong advocacy in the community. And I'm going to focus my remarks particularly on the early care and learning community. There are some pieces that we are still advocating for being included. I think I would echo what Kuna said. It's increasingly less likely we'll get anything. And if we get anything, it will be extremely small, probably something around prescription drugs. Many of the pieces, even last week talked about, have now seemed to fade away with lack of consensus. But I will mention to you that the early childhood community has not given up at all. And just recently, in May, two of the senators prepared a more modified version of the early care and learning pieces that were in the original bill that passed the House last summer and were pulled off the floor in the Senate when they couldn't reach agreement according to the reconciliation rules. And there's a link on your screen, and you do have all of these slides. There's a lot of detail on them, but you'll have them as a resource for later. There's a link to that modified early learning proposal. And I think you all know the early childhood community. We won't give up until it's over. And then if we can't get these provisions in a particular bill, like where we are with this one, we'll keep on pushing. But the deadline for these rules, these Senate rules that we're operating under, is September 30th. So as Kuna said, it really is getting less and less likely we'll be able to do that. I'm going to move now to funding and to early childhood in particular, spend a couple of slides talking about the dollars and then about the policies. The year we are currently in right now is federal 2022. So that's exactly where we are. And you can see in the first two bullets that we got small increases both in the Birth to 3 IDEA program and the Preschool Special Ed 619 program. Those funds went to states in their allocation awards just recently, a couple weeks ago, on the July 1 awards. And only one of the proposed policy changes, and we'll be talking about that in a few slides in more detail, but we had about 8 proposals in that funding bill as it worked its way through the Congress last year. In the end, one was included in the final bill. There are some others that have been there for other years and they stayed, but the one in particular I want to highlight for you is on the bottom of that slide. And basically, we kind of think of it as summer bridge money. And what it does is it gives the Part C lead agencies the permission, if they want, and if parents consent, to keep children in the Part C program until the beginning of the next school year for children who turn 3. This is meant for children with summer birthdays, and it's meant really to bridge the gap. There's a tremendous amount of work to be done, and I think I would say the field is hoping for some good guidance from the department on how we might orchestrate the relationship between the Part C and the 619 programs, because the language around FAPE at 3 still applies, certainly in the statute and regs, but this particular change, when in the budget and is considered current law, even though it came to us through a federal appropriations bill. I will keep it in the back of your mind because it's in the new bill that's just been proposed. But why don't we talk a little bit about the dollar figures? I've got the next 2 slides. I will not read them to you, you're glad. But the president's budget request for this year, so move now from 2022 to 2023, President introduced, as Kuna said, his request, sent it up to the Congress a couple of months ago. Just always remember when you're thinking of the president's request, it's not binding, doesn't get voted on, but it really starts the conversation. In order to finish it by September 30th, and as Kuna said, it's very unlikely we'll be finishing. We probably will have kind of a kick the can on down the road continuing resolution agreed to, at least through the election. But basically, in order to finish those dollar figures, the House, the Senate, and the President must agree on every single funding dollar figure for each of those programs. The President's budget request this year, the same as last year, proposed significant increases to programs that are important to early childhood, young children, and their families. And that includes, and you can see toward the bottom of the screen, an increase of Part C to $932 million. It includes some more proposed policy changes. So it's meant to not only increase funds, but change requirements. And some were included last year and some are not. So why don't we look at the next two slides? I just want to orient you. We'll do one at a time, not read it to you, but let you know that when you take this away, this slide covers the IDEA programs that we're discussing right now, plus special ed research, which of course is critically important to the IDEA programs. And it has three columns. The left column is the current year, is last year. The middle column is the current year that we're in. And you can again see those, if you will, slight increases we achieved this year. And then the third column has the President's budget request. And in almost all cases, there's an anomaly with the special ed research, but in almost all cases but that, there's significant proposals for increases. And on the following slide, you'll see the same amount of detail that you could, again, tuck away as a resource for other related programs that we follow that are important to young children and their families. Child Care Block Grant, Head Start, Early Head Start, Maternal and Child Health Block Grant, the EDDY program, the Preschool Development Grant program that many states count on for all of their systemic birth to 5 work, and the relatively new Infant and Early Child Mental Health Bill. And when you compare the numbers, part of what you will see, your takeaway is that the President again proposed significant increases. Now, I really would like to be very excited about those from our standpoint, and I think advocacy is building the momentum to say, perfect, this is just what we need. But what happened last year is those numbers were just the high water mark. So we keep advocating, keep pushing, but that's the high water mark. So if you go to the next slide, I want to show you. So as Kuna had that great timeline out before, we have the President's budget request. And the only other step that we really have numbers on yet is the House Appropriations Committee. And that markup has the numbers for some of our key programs right here. And you're going to notice right off the bat that the programs have increases over the current year. So there are increases, but it does not include as significant as the increases are in the President's budget request, except for Head Start and Child Care. Those two are along the more closer to what the President requested, but nonetheless increases. And I think when you see the significance of the Part C increase, keep in mind that what we're going to start talking about now are some of those proposals that increase is slated to represent paying for or accounting for in the state implementation. So let's talk a little bit about what the President was wanting and the statements from the budget request that I think lay the groundwork for what those policy changes are. And I want to move a little quickly on the policy changes, but keep in mind the red highlights on these slides, if that's a helpful construct for you as you're looking, talking about increasing and reforming Part C, and talking about particularly addressing historically underrepresented children, children of color, children of low-income families, talking about closing gaps and promoting and increasing equity. And I think that really says it all, because that really is the purpose of these increases and these policy changes proposed. So let's look at a couple of those as we go. The first two on this particular slide are not in the House bill, and they showed up in the President's budget request. Now, they could very well again show up in the Senate bill. We won't know that for a couple of weeks yet, but I'll just mention them. One was a set aside in the President's budget request for a $200 million extra incentive fund if states wanted to serve at risk. Presented lots of issues around definition and exploration of what that really means in states' eligibility criteria, but that's not in the House bill, which kind of sends us a signal. The second one then is an absolute change in the entire Part C funding formula, which really does strike us, I think, is a little bit surprising. No, we don't, changing funding formulas are almost impossible in the Congress. Somebody wins, somebody loses. It's very difficult to come to agreement. And what we want to do is make sure that something like this gets the time, bandwidth, and the hearings. Excuse my visitor. But why don't we go to the next slide? I don't think it's a surprise that the change in the funding formula did not show up in the House bill. I frankly would kind of crystal ball it a little bit and say it probably won't in the Senate bill, but I guess we'll see. So here we have a couple of policies now that were also in the president's budget request and in the House bill. So it won't surprise us if they show up in the Senate bill. Whether or not we get them at the end of the year is the big question. And remember, last year we didn't. We only got that transition one. So the first one is giving states flexibility to use their Part C money for child find and public awareness for children who have not yet been born. So working with families, for instance, who've received pre-birth diagnoses and using your funds for that. That would be the first one, both in the House and the president's bill. The second is a requirement, and this was in last year's proposal as well, and this would require every state who receives a grant under Part C to set aside at least 10% of their federal allocation to use that for an equity plan. Those equity plans would have to be approved by the Secretary of Education, and there would be annual reporting on those plans. If we go to the next slide, let's look at a couple more that are included both in the House and the president's budget request. This first one, which would prohibit states in Part D from having any policies that would charge families any fees or any out-of-pocket expenses. And that was in last year, and we'll wait and see. Clearly, that's something that will cost some states some money. So I think we watch and see if the funds are there. That might, in fact, go through. And the one under that is requiring states to give a longer period of time for notice on if they're trying to change their eligibility criteria. The language is a little different in both bills. So why don't we keep moving, because we're almost done with the proposal. This transition one that we showed when we started is also in this year. So I don't think it's hard to assume that this will go through, and we will have this one as we move forward. Let's go to the next slide. Kuna mentioned this funding formula bill that we have for early childhood. It mirrors the Part B funding formula bill. I will tell you up front, the pun is intended. It's Funding Early Childhood is the Right Idea Act. And like the other bill, like the Part B bill, it has a glide path for increasing authorization levels in the statute for Part C and for preschool. This bill has been introduced. It's bipartisan in the House, and we're watching and advocating through the field for getting more and more members to sign onto the bill. I want to quickly mention two things before we wrap up here. One is we have some things that are overdue, and one of them in particular on the next slide deserves the most attention, I believe. We have a long queue here. The queue's been going on for a number of Congresses. It is not moving. As Kuna said, it's very difficult for them to reach consensus right now. It is so the disagreements and just the environment is not conducive to coming to agreement. But the one program on here that's bolded at the bottom is home visiting, a very important program to our community. It, unlike all the other programs who will continue if they get funded, home visiting expires if it reaches its reauthorization date. If it's not reauthorized, it's over, it's gone. And so we only have until September 30th, a few short months. So far, the language has not appeared in any bill that's moving anywhere. So we're really worried about this. The next slide has some packages that show you about the value of home visiting in your state. They were just released by the First 5 Years Fund and may be helpful to you. This is a all hands on deck from the whole community working on making sure that home visiting is reauthorized. They have a significant coalition working on it. And there's lots of support for it. Rarely does anybody say, I don't like the home visiting program, but it's a matter of getting things through. And on the last two slides, I'll just leave that for your review later. These are the current ITCA priorities, the Infant Toddler Coordinators Association. You can see telehealth, child find, equity, etc., coordinator support, leadership. The coordinator positions turn over just extremely often, very frequent, both for C and for 619 coordinators. And so we have a priority for making sure that we keep orienting those new coordinators and providing leadership training. And then the next slide, of course, would be the DEC priorities. And you can see that's an agenda that was approved in May of 2020. And all these materials are on the websites cited there. But for DEC, it's high quality inclusion, addressing bias, responding appropriately to children's behavior, family partnerships, effective workforce. And on that effective workforce, I would really like to turn things over now to Caitlin, who's going to talk to us about the workforce, because that is everyone's most challenging problem right now, Kate, right?
Right, Sharon. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for all of that great information from you and Kuna. So I appreciate you teeing me up here. And thanks so much for everyone being here today. I'm going to discuss the special educator shortages and really looking at this from a pipeline through practice problem. We can get started here. So you all know this, and you probably know it better than anybody. But there was a problem in terms of our workforce long before the COVID-19 pandemic. I was a special educator over a decade ago, and I can recall, being pulled from my role to act as a classroom substitute, right? Because I wasn't anchored to a specific class. So I was my itinerant, so I was able to be pulled from my job responsibilities, right? So this was over a decade ago, and this goes back much farther than that. So just to dig into some of the specifics here, even prior to the pandemic, special education was the field with the greatest shortage. So we saw 48 states in DC, and this goes back to 1978, right? So long before the 10 years whenever I was in the classroom. And we saw it between 2005 and 2012, this 17% decline in the number of special education teachers. At the same time, we saw an increase of about 400,000 students who were receiving special education services. I'm going to talk in a bit about the last decade and what we've seen, and that number's nearly doubled, right? And we know that there's a disproportionate impact here that's happening. So high poverty schools are more likely than those well-resourced schools to have not only teacher shortages, but folks in the building who are unqualified or perhaps inexperienced educators. Next slide, please. Thank you. And we know the pandemic didn't make things better. I think Kuna mentioned this earlier that, education is really at the forefront. This is in everybody's faces right now, whether you have a child or you're an educator or working in higher ed, or it's just happening in your community or folks that you know. We've seen, schools transition to 4-day school weeks or needing to transition to some type of online instruction, and for a variety of reasons because of the pandemic, right? But we've seen, troubles with affordability, with childcare for folks, right? Looking at workplace conditions and how the shortage makes those worse. So when we look here at some of the data since the pandemic has started, as of November 2020, there were already 1 million jobs lost, education jobs due to the pandemic. I think that we've probably all spoken to a teacher who has been considering leaving the field, and that number is increasing. So there's nearly 1 in 4 teachers that indicated they were likely to leave their jobs or are considering it. And prior to the pandemic, that number was 1 in 6. In the 2021-2022 school year alone, 44% of U.S. public schools indicated that they had at least a full or part-time teaching vacancy. And what's important to keep in mind here, and again, you all know this, is that special education doesn't just fall on the special educator, right? So this is specialized instructional support personnel, these are general educators, related service providers, and so forth. So when one of those folks, is removed, this is impacting our students really significantly. But of those, if you can just go back one more slide real quick. Of those vacancies, nearly 45% of those were special education teaching positions, and 61% of those individuals explicitly identified that they were leaving. That role was vacant because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you so much. So what's needed? Well, today I think that we're talking a lot, and we're going to dig in even more on some of the federal levers that are available to us. Kuna and Sharon do such a great job of reviewing that content. But this is really an all hands on deck approach from the feds, states, and locals. But without significant intervention, what we're seeing is that, by the 2025-2026 school year, there's projected to be a shortfall of roughly 200,000 public school teachers. That number is, was startling to me when I first read it, and I'm sure it is for all of you. Based on the Bureau of Labor and Statistics projections, so we're looking at between 2020 and 2030, 37,600 new special education teachers will be required to keep up with the demand. So if you look at the last decade prior to the pandemic, between 2010 and 2020, the number of students who receive special ed service increased by approximately 800,000 students. And we still don't know what the impact of the pandemic is going to be. That data is still coming out. We're still in it, right? So we don't know how that's going to continue to increase. And we know that our field has never been reflective of our country, right, and of the world. So in 2018, there were 1/4 fewer Black and Latinx teachers who are enrolled in teacher preparation programs compared to 2010. That's an issue that we're not only concerned with rebuilding the pipeline, but diversifying the pipeline. Next slide, please. So what's happening? You all have seen this. It's picking up more coverage. It's happening in your neighborhoods. In order to meet the demand, states are increasingly turning to the use of long-term substitutes. We've seen, in areas of places lowering standards, right? Making it easier to get people in the classroom. For special education teachers and across the board. Sometimes this means only a high school diploma, and often with no teacher training at all. You may have read about the National Guard being called in Ohio and New Mexico to serve as educators. We've heard conversations about parents of kids with disabilities being asked to sub as special educators. We're seeing increasingly folks who are turning to alternative certification routes that don't have as robust of a credentialing process and the information and the skill set that's needed, or the practicum experiences that are needed for folks, knowing that our field is a really specific area and requires a very specific skill set. So if you look here in the 2020-2021 school year, 16% of new teachers were individuals who were not fully prepared. That's an 80% increase just from 2014 to 2015. And if you look here, there were at least, during the 2018-2019 school year alone, so prior to the pandemic again, and we already saw, what was happening there, there were at least 25,243 special education teacher positions that were filled by individuals who were not fully qualified for those positions. So specifically in the state of Nevada, 20.44% of those serving as special ed teachers were not fully qualified. In Louisiana, we're looking at 18%, Oklahoma, 15%. And in Texas, there were 5,800 individuals who were serving as special education teachers who were not fully qualified to do so. If you want to think about this in terms of how many kids are on each of those educators' caseloads, it's really alarming. So what's happening? We're seeing that folks are coming out again, unprepared or underprepared. We know that those who are prepared through alternative pathways that require less coursework and student teaching experiences are 25% more likely to leave their not only their positions, but the profession at large compared to those who are well prepared. And again, there's a disproportionate impact here where we're seeing high poverty schools, again, more likely than well-resourced schools to have unqualified or inexperienced teachers. And in special education, the rate of turnover is even higher. So of practicing special education teachers, it's reported that the turnover rate is about twice that of gen ed teachers. And we're looking at about as much as 15% per year. Something that's really alarming, and we know this, is that teacher turnover has significant negative impacts, particularly for students with disabilities and students of color. So if you look here, a GAO report found that there was a positive relationship between the percentage of inexperienced teachers and the likelihood that students would receive a range of disciplinary consequences, things like expulsion, suspension, referral to law enforcement. Last week we were at the CEC and Case held their special education legislative summit, and Sharon and Kuna and I were there, and one of the speakers said, it's the difference between push out and drop out, right? And so I think we see that there. Next slide. So you guys know this, we know it, full preparation matters. And we must invest in the pipeline. So those critical investments that Kuna touched on earlier are really important now, perhaps more than ever before. So the pipeline of teachers we have is insufficient. There's 340,000 fewer students who are enrolled in teacher prep programs in 2019 compared to 2010. And then we're seeing a shortage of special education faculty in higher education that's contributing to that shortage. It's limiting the capacity for departments and institutions of higher education to address this significant problem. And again, going back, we know that critical importance of comprehensive preparation that happens at institutions of higher education. Between 2009 and 2018, we saw a 19% reduction in the number of special education doctoral programs, bringing that number to 79 programs nationwide. It was the lowest level in decades. So again, with this decline, we saw a 17% reduction in the number of graduates from doctoral programs who are able to take on those leadership positions in districts or to go back into teacher preparation programs at institutions of higher education, a 17% decline there. And we know that in states that have comprehensive educator preparation programs, there's less of a shortage of special educators. The more teacher prep programs, the less of a problem that we see there. Next slide. So in summary, we've seen, workforce conditions have definitely been impacted by the shortage. There's certainly been attacks on public education, and this is contributing to what we're seeing. The cost of higher education is a concern, and the salaries for educators, right? We're seeing decreasing standards and increasing turnover and attrition in the field. So a lot of folks who are enrolling perhaps in alternative preparation programs. And when I say that, I mean outside of an institution of higher education. And what's needed is really a robust federal investment coupled with those efforts at the state and local levels. So I appreciate your time today and looking forward to questions. And with that, I'll pass it back to Dan.
Thanks. All right, we have some questions in the chat. Let's do this one. Who can share with us an update about the status of the Keeping All Students Safe Act?
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm happy to take that one on. So for folks who aren't familiar, the Keeping All Students Safe Act is the bill that's been introduced in the House and Senate, actually many Congresses in a row. And the current bill would ban seclusion and significantly restrict when it is lawful for restraints to be used. This is a bill that the disability community tracks really closely because it disproportionately impacts children with disabilities. So I think the question is about the status of that bill, and I can just give you a brief status update. The House bill has about 112 co-sponsors. Senate bill has 19. Earlier this year, the House held an oversight hearing on restraint and seclusion and other discipline policies. Unfortunately, I do not think that bill is actually going to advance through this Congress. One of the major challenges is that it continues to be a partisan bill. It is introduced by and only supported by Democrats. And I think folks know by now that in the Senate, you need a good number of Republicans to join with Democrats in order to pass a Democratic initiative. And likewise, there needs to be strong bipartisan support for anything to move through the Senate. So that's a quick status update on that bill.
Great. Thanks, Kuna. Anyone else any other thoughts on that one? If not, I will jump on to another one. So obviously, because the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been large historic increases in funding for the Department of Education, and that money's flowed down to states and to LEAs and other IHEs and Part C providers. So what are thoughts about after that money runs out? Is there any sort of momentum to keep that funding level going? Or the Recovery Act, we call that the funding cliff. Is that something that education leaders should be thinking about?
Yeah, I'll start off and then I'll let my colleagues join in on this one. Technically, there was a large budget increase for the Department of Education, but I just want folks to be really clear that that funding was intended to specifically address the challenges that were brought on by the pandemic. So it was one-time funding, so it wasn't really an increase in the funding levels for the Department of Education. And so when we go on Capitol Hill and talk to appropriators about annual funding, we differentiate it from that stimulus funding, and we really lean in on the messaging that what we actually need in order to improve public education is increases in the ongoing annual, somewhat reliable funding that that we work for every year. So what we need is long-term funding and not one-time funding.
I think I would just echo, I think Kuna's point is really important to remember. We don't consider those as a change in the baseline funding. They were for a very specific purpose. And so when we go up to the Hill, we talk about current year funding being that very small amount of increase we got last year. The rescue money is very well spoken for. As a matter of fact, people are pushing to try to get some extensions in the amount of time states can use to spend those dollars. But they were critical. They are critical, and they're being used for very important pandemic-related expenses.
I would just echo my colleagues there, and that, if we're looking at education funding across the board, it historically has not kept up with the rate of inflation, and we've been historically underfunded. So again, just not much to add there other than to echo my colleagues.
Great. And we got thank you all. So some other questions. We did get some questions about specific programs and the budgets, like for the Part D program and infant and toddler mental health grant. We've got links for those that we'll share subsequently. Do want to ask sort of a last question and get your thoughts. As you've shared so much information, I mean, obviously you guys do this work for a living. Like if someone was sort of getting wet or wanted to get their feet wet into this, like what recommendations would you have about becoming more involved and getting more knowledgeable about policy issues and sort of the appropriation process? And what are your thoughts?
I want to start that one if I can. Kate and Kuna, I feel like there's a couple of tips we all try to give over time. One is to remember that you, in speaking to someone like that, Dan, you are the expert in the field. So if you're a person working with families every day, you know way more about the topic. You are the expert. And for us to be creating relationships with our congressional members, our two senators' offices, our congressperson's office, and their staff in your home district office, they need that expertise. They need to know you, creating a trusting relationship where they can reach out to you for information when they're trying to make a decision on supporting or not supporting something or working hard on something. I think it really is all about building that trusting relationship, not just going to them when we want something, but going to them to report some good news, to invite them to take advantage of seeing or visiting, hearing about, meeting with families that benefit from the programs that they are so important in funding, and just, I think, relationship.
Yeah, we've got some pretty low-hanging fruit if folks feel energized and want to do some advocating right now. You're welcome to go to CEC's Legislative Action Center. It's online. It's on our website, and right now we have action alerts up in support of the programs that I laid out today, including the educator pipeline, school-based mental health, appropriations, and we also have an action alert for supporting funding early childhood is the right idea, a bill that Sharon has taken the lead on. And there are lots of other ways to advocate. I think it was mentioned earlier, we're just coming off of our special education legislative summit. We do that annually. And if you're a member of an association, there's likely an opportunity to advocate through that channel as well. At CEC, we try to present appropriate opportunities to advocate at the right time. That's part of what I do. And we get a lot of really good feedback when the people on the ground, the real experts, do chime in on policy.
And Kuna, I would just add with those letters, the exciting thing if you've not done one of those letters is you can personalize the letter. It's very quick. And then when you turn around and a day or two later, you get an email back from your senator's office or your congressperson's office, and you realize that somebody got that letter, ticked it off, put it in the pro column for that particular activity. And I think, as Kuna said, if you haven't been doing a lot of this work, it's a really nice way and a very quick and easy way to start.
I would just add that, in addition to everything that Sharon and Kuna said, is that you don't need to be an expert in every area of policymaking or appropriations to get to the table on this, but you're needed at the table. And so I think, as both of Sharon and Kuna mentioned, is that you all are the experts in your areas within the field, and you also know your story better than anybody else. And telling that is really, really important.
Bring them the data and tell them your story. And that really is the best way to be an advocate.
Nice. Thank you all. I think we are just about at time here. So once again, I want to thank our panelists for a fantastic presentation. Learned so much very quickly. So please utilize the resources that are attached the PowerPoint, which will be attached in the recording, to share with your colleagues. And want to thank you. And I know I have to hop off because I'm going to another session in 15 minutes. So it was great to see everyone. And thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you all.
For having me.
Thank you.